Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Faithful Presence Podcast. I am your host, Michael Langer, ordained minister and founder of Faithful Presence, a ministry here based in Washington, D.C., really committed to the idea of whole life discipleship for the whole of life in the whole of the public square. We do that through focusing on discipleship, on whole life discipleship. And what we mean by that is that we believe that spiritual, emotional, relational, vocational, ideological, cultural, and evangelical formation are critical for the way in which Christians come to live out their life in the public square. So today we're going to be doing something special. We're going to try something for the first time we've been working on for a couple months, and that is we are going to be video podcasting this. Some of you will be able to see us if you go to our website. You can actually click on one of the links there and you can actually see and watch this video version of this podcast, if you will. And we're also going to make this the very first one of our, what we hope to be maybe monthly, maybe every 6 weeks, kind of cultural roundtables where we just kind of like face the nation, kind of like we just face the gospel and talk about what's going on in the world. What are some articles that have been out there recently that people have been talking about? And we just want to kind of like just dive into them. And for that, one of the people that we hope to have every single time is my very good friend, Jeremy Knapp, because one, he's my very good friend, and two, because Jeremy Knapp is a connoisseur of culture. So I live in culture. I enjoy culture. But Jeremy seems to understand it in a way that has always just, I would say, left me standing in awe of the amount of books and things that he's read, his insights into various aspects of culture and what's going on. And so it's going to be, hopefully he will be a recurring guest on this form of the roundtable. And each time we get together, we're going to try to take 3 or 4 articles and just kind of talk through them a little bit. And so, Jeremy, thanks for joining me. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing really well. What an embarrassing intro. I mean, I you know, the thing is, the more you read, the more you realize you haven't read. So yeah. I sometimes feel my stupidity more than.
Yeah. So you, Jeremy, are the person who taught me, I think, when I was in Iowa City, that I needed to read a lot more. And I needed to read, I would say this, not just read a lot more, but I needed to read differently. I needed to read different books from different places. I think you're the guy who introduced me to the Mars Hill audio series, which revolutionized my life and made me feel like the most insignificant reader of all time. Because the guy who hosts that podcast, I think, has read literally every single book.
I mean, Ken Myers. I mean, he's a walking library.
Yeah, so we'll never measure up to that. Jeremy, tell us a little bit about what you do there in St. Louis. I know you're teaching AP English to young minds at Lutheran South. Tell us a little bit about what's your daily life like there.
Well, my daily life is I'm a high school English teacher who 80% of my job is teaching in the dual credit program between my high school and St. Louis University, Catholic institution, Jesuit institution here in town. And it's a Lutheran community, it's a Christian community, and it's it's also a private school community located in a section of St. Louis County that is demographically non-urban, more suburban. But I live in the city of St. Louis, so I get a bit of both worlds because I have a lot of urban dwellers at my church. So I kind of keep my feet on both sides of that, sometimes sadly ever widening divide in American culture.
Yeah. And before this, so you have returned to the United States. I would say this, you've not returned to the United States to take this job. You've returned to the United States so your wife can take a position, and you, shall we
That's
say,
correct.
kind of tagged along with her, and were able to find this wonderful position. So tell us a little bit, remind our listeners who maybe haven't caught the first podcast with you, what you were doing in Korea, both you and your wife, and what she's doing here now.
So my wife is a musician. She's an organist, and she was a performer as well as a university professor at Yonsei University in Seoul, where she taught organ performance and organ, literature, history of Christianity, history of Christian music. And I was teaching literature at the Catholic University of Korea, and I specialized in courses on minority fiction, minority literatures in English, as well as new immigrant fiction. And I also taught a course in Korean American literature and a course in poetry. And every semester I had at least one course in essay writing as well. And I think that's been a feature of my career. I don't think I've gone a single semester without teaching a course that is geared towards essay writing.
Really? Wow. That's great.
It's the workhorse. It's the workhorse of all English departments, no matter at what level. Yeah. So then when we moved back to the States after about almost 13 years abroad, I switched to teaching at the high school level, and it's a challenge. I always did have this suspicion that the people teaching at the high school or middle school or elementary school level were much better teachers than those of us who were teaching at the university level. And gosh, it's true. I mean, I stand in awe of my colleagues every day.
Well, I can for sure remember some of my favorite. I don't have a favorite college professor. I have favorite seminary professors, but I absolutely have high school professors or high school teachers that changed the trajectory of my life by the way in which they came alongside me, the way in which they presented information. I had other high school teachers, though, that absolutely killed interests for me, like math and science. I loved math and science till I got into high school, and the teachers there I just was done. I was done. But man, oh man, English and history, political science, those guys were great. I love them all. And it's their fault I'm here, I guess, basically. So here's what I want to do. We're going to talk about 3 articles today. I want to talk about David Brooks's article recently in the New York Times called Hey, Wake Up America. I want to talk about a recent Peter Leithart article from First Things, where he's really actually talking about Nancy Pearcey's book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. That article is called Man Up. And then I want to talk about Anne Snyder's work, Words Against Flesh. And as we talk about these, I think a theme is going to emerge about kind of the way in which we as people and as Christians are supposed to interact in the world. But let's start with David Brooks, who in the early part of this article here that came out early August, he writes this. He says, in earlier cultural epochs, many people derived their self-worth from their relationship with God or from their ability to be a winner in the commercial marketplace. But in a therapeutic culture, which is really the point of this article, is pushing back against what he calls the therapeutic culture, people's sense of self-worth depends on their subjective feelings about themselves. Do I feel good about myself, and do I like me? So, I mean, I enjoyed this article quite a bit. I think as a person who is currently, I see my therapist, my counselor once a week. Initially, I was like, I hope you're not saying that anybody who's experienced trauma is promoting the therapeutic culture. And I don't think he is, but I'd be interested to hear what kind of your take was on this article.
Well, I kind of agreed with you at first. I like to follow certain figures that remind us that there is a possibility of following health through mental therapy, mental health. I don't want to discredit that. So I was a little bit, what is David doing here when I first opened the article as well? But what I felt in the about halfway through the article was I realized that what he's talking about is a shift in our culture that goes simply from saying, therapy is something that is helpful to saying that this spirit of victimization is the only way of finding a true identity, or the spirit of being a victim is the way you, by paying attention to your trauma, is how you really come into your full self. And I think that that's kind of what he was really after. And it reminded me of a different cultural moment. There was a discussion, or not a discussion, there was a lecture that Flannery O'Connor gave at Georgetown University in the early 60s, a few years before she died. And remember, she's somebody who, spent her entire life being traumatized, right? Suffering with lupus, and also suffering under the pitiless gaze of a highly masculinized publication culture in New York City that she was able to crack through her own wit and intelligence. And also, she was a minority as a Roman Catholic author living in the heavily Baptist and heavily modernist South. So she had her own fair share of adversity. But she gave this speech in the early 60s, and she said, the great trouble with our age is that humans now define themselves by what they find themselves doing. That their activity is what gives them their being, rather than understanding what their status as created beings, rather than understanding their status in sort of as created for relationship and created for bringing good into the world. She saw a shift that the engines of late capital had moved us on to a place where we defined ourselves by our activity rather than by having a predetermined understanding of what we are. And in Brooks' article, he says, for many people, trauma became their source of identity. People began defining themselves by the way they had been hurt. And that seems to be a step further beyond what Flannery O'Connor was warning us about in the 60s. And so that's what that triggered for me. It was, okay, so now we've gone beyond sort of defining ourselves by activity. Now we're defining ourselves by our passivity, if you will.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that you used the phrase, that's what triggered in me, since that's exactly the very thing that David Brooks is talking about, that the 2013 was the year of the trigger warning.
The year of the trigger,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so we didn't used to talk
we
about
have all these metaphors at the same time.
Yeah, no one, when I was younger, I never heard the word microaggression. I didn't even know what that word was. I didn't know what a trigger warning was. And now we have them. Now they're kind of a part of what we deal with every day.
And yet, I think I remember pretty clearly the first time I heard that word, and I immediately knew what it was.
Really?
Nobody needed to explain it to me because it's in the air we breathe, right? There's this idea that if somebody offers you something that, is roughly adverse to what you would prefer, then it is not merely inconvenient or not merely faultless. It is aggressive on their part.
Yeah. So one of the things,
no matter how small.
Yeah. One of the things I wonder is, you spent 13 years in Korea. Is this a thing there too, or is it very unique?
To a much lesser degree, although the concept of like victim cosplay and the concept of somebody who denies their activity as there can only be one explanation for it. If they deny wrongdoing, that it can only be that they're gaslighting you. It can never be the case. It can never be the case that they actually didn't do the thing they've been accused of. That has sort of infected the public discourse there a little bit as well. Maybe not to the same pervasive measure that it has here in America, but yeah, it's coming in.
So he says in about the second page, he says here, fast forward a few decades, and the sense of lostness and insecurity, which Lash and many others had seen in its nascent form, has transmorgified, and he gets the $5 bonus for using the word transmorgified in a sentence, into a roaring epidemic of psychic pain. By, say, 2010, it became clear that we were in the middle of a mental health crisis with rising depression and suicide rates, an epidemic of hopelessness and despair among the young. Social media became a place where people were begging for attention, validation, and affirmation, even if they found rejection instead. And so I guess I have two kind of thoughts on this. The one is I think he's very right about pointing out the role that social media has played in this, to put your feelings out there, that we're making decisions now based on how I feel. How does that make me feel? And how do I want to feel? And how should I feel? And so absolutely social media is driving this, but I wonder if it's not also true that our current political moment also benefits from this. That if I find as he says in the very first page, if I find my self-worth from my relationship with God, there's really no way for the quote unquote the politician who wants to use me for his own political ends. So I'm not painting all politicians with this same brush, but
Sure.
If you can get me to move off of this, and this is what C.S. Lewis talks about, in the Screw Tape Letters, if you can get me to move off of finding my identity in Christ and in the gospel, and get me to find it in my feelings and what I've been deprived of and what's happened to me, and you can offer me the solution to that,
right?
Then that works for you. Then that actually works for the political system in
Right.
a certain way. And so I wonder if social media and the political moment that we're in, where we're talking about polarization just moving rapidly, if those two things aren't actually dance partners.
Of course they are. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of prima facie. But I have to say, this is not an accidental move. I think that the identity politics movements that I was dealing with when I was back at, when I met you, the University of Iowa, these 20 years ago now, it was politics all the way down. I remember being sort of mocked in a doctoral seminar because I actually pretended that the human being had some sort of status that stood apart from their games and any sort of will to power. And I had one of my friends. She was kind to me outside of class, but we were sparring partners inside class. She looked at me and she used an expletive. "Oh my effing God, Jeremy, you really are a humanist." I think she literally couldn't. She literally couldn't believe that I thought there was something within the human person that was not touched by politics.
Yeah.
So that was the world that I was being trained in at that time.
Yeah, Iowa City was awesome for that, wasn't it? It was the perfect petri dish for all of these discussions that are happening. So one of the things I want,
but the reason why it's politics all the way down is because when you lose a coherent sense of the good, then you no longer have anything left other than plays to power of some form or another, whether those are political power or sexual power or some other, might makes right ethic. And he comes very close to this when, he talks about the least mature. This is at the bottom of the paragraph where he says, "Left or right, apparently we're all victims now."
Yes.
Brooks says, in institution after institution, from churches to schools to nonprofits, the least mature voices dominate and hurl accusations, while the most mature lie low, trying to get through the day. I mean, that's almost a direct recap of William Butler Yeats' famous poem, "The Second Coming," where he talks about, he gives the image of a falcon who is flying in the air above the falconer, and that falcon gets wider and wider in their circles, and eventually the falcon can no longer hear the voice of the falconer. And he says, and this is parallel to our day, where the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeah. And, that's David Brooks, just, in the words of William Butler Yeats 100 years earlier.
This is why you have to be on these episodes to help me navigate this, because I'm never reaching for a Yeats quote ever. I have to read him first, which I just haven't found time to do.
He won a Nobel Prize in the context of a culture that had been torn apart over this question of identity. I mean, Ireland went through this postmodern revolution in the 1920s. So there's a reason why he's asking these questions.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I appreciated is he actually mentions Jordan Peterson by name, right? Who also is having
unabashedly.
Yes. He says here, this counter reaction to the coddlers came from what you might call an anti-fragile coalition. This was led by Jordan Peterson and thousands of his lesser imitators, from Senator Josh Hawley to an army of masculinist influencers. So
Yes.
he was not afraid to name names in this article. And,
Yes.
I have had in the last maybe year and a half, 2 years, a number of people say, "Oh, are you familiar with Jordan Peterson? Do you know Jordan Peterson? You should write something about Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson's really, really..."
As though you couldn't know.
Right? Jordan Peterson suddenly he is also having a moment, but I think what Brooke says is spot on, that Jordan Peterson is having a moment because of kind of where we've gotten as a society, where some people have just gotten completely fed up with it. And maybe they're
Yeah.
fed up with the straw man stereotype of it, but there is this kind of cultural backlash, which again, I think is leading to the separation of America. Like the pulling apart of America is, you're either in the therapeutic side or you're in the I got no time for you side. And so I'd be interested to hear kind of what your thoughts are on the kind of whole Jordan Peterson pushback.
Well, I mean, Jordan Peterson is, way more learned than I am. I think that he's provided sort of an oasis in the desert for people finding a counter narrative that sort of satisfies what they know by instinct to be wrong in the broader culture. I let's see what happens, in the future. His story has not been written yet. I know he has some contact with a cultural commentator that I respect and admire very much, which is Bishop Robert Barron, the Roman Catholic Archbishop. He was formerly the auxiliary Archbishop for the Diocese of Los Angeles. Now he's been moved to Minneapolis area, northern Minnesota. And I know that Jordan Peterson does not shy away from good influences. So I'm happy to hear more voices in the conversation. I'm sorry. Do you want to say something?
No, I don't want to say. I want to just sit and drink from the well of your knowledge.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take you back to David Brooks.
Okay.
And what I really liked about this article was his. He didn't just say, we're in a big pile of poop. We are also able to see our way back to something. And he didn't just leave us hanging in the bad. There was a couple of really beautiful paragraphs toward the end of the article. He talks about, in a non-therapeutic ethos, people don't build secure identities on their own. They weave their stable selves out of their commitments to and attachments with others. Their identities are forged as they fulfill responsibilities as friends, family members, employees, neighbors, and citizens. The process is social and other absorbed, not therapeutic. I mean, that's a sort of a forthright declaration that relationship is higher than knowledge or skill or power or any of these other rubrics we try to apply to ourselves to measure up to what we think might be our salvation, right? We were created for relationship. And it turns out that allowing yourself to be enmeshed in those relationships and living out your vocation with purpose and with joy in the context of the networks that God's placed you in turns out to be a really, really healthy way to live a life. And I just really appreciated that. I was a little bit dubious coming to St. Louis a year ago. I had watched from afar the country being torn apart by by new strife over racism, America's original sin, things that had gone down in Ferguson, and I moved back very shortly up on the cultural resettling over George Floyd and what went down up there in the Twin Cities. And I knew that St. Louis was rife with this racial strife as well. And I also knew that St. Louis was represented by some of the far left-leaning members of Congress, while Missouri as a whole was represented by some of the far right-wingers, the nuttiest of the nutty, like election deniers and whatnot. And I thought, okay, I could be either moving into a place that is really, really bad, or really, really isolated to the point of being sort of deliberately self-deceiving.
Yeah.
And it turns out I moved back to a community where people are working really hard to raise their kids, and they're cheering their kids on when they have sports meets, and they're working really hard to make enough money to do that extension on their house that they want because their house is too small. Why? Because they've had another kid. And I moved to a place where I see every day 100 students pour through my classrooms who are eager to learn. Why? Because they're looking forward to going into a world and taking up a vocation, or going on to a university and taking up more study so that they can later take up a good vocation. And I've been very refreshed by watching people enmesh themselves in these social relationships. And it hasn't been nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be moving back to America during a time of great political strife and upheaval.
So one of the things he said, and this is the part where I like, okay, this is going to connect us, I think, to a broader discussion about the centrality of not just spiritual, but also emotional and relational formation. He says this, if we're going to build a culture in which it is easier to be mature, we're going to have to throw off some of the tenets of the therapeutic culture. Maturity, now as ever, is understanding that you're not the center of the universe. The world isn't a giant story about me or about you. And this is one of the, interestingly, this is one of the topics that my counselor and I talk about pretty regularly, because we've got a lot of stuff going on in our life, which, you know about. We're just dealing with a bunch of things, particularly with one of our kids. And, one of the things that my counselor reminds me all the time is he's like, hey, just so you know, you are less human than Jesus. You are experiencing a humanity that Jesus did not experience, because he's fully human and wasn't marred by sin, and you are. And so the thing is this world better not be about you, because you are so far from perfect and so far from being, the person who this universe should be about. You don't want that to happen. Like, you need to just embrace the fact that you are human in a way that precludes you from being the center of the universe. And this comment really does get us back to the gospel, which is the idea that if the universe is about me and my therapeutic feelings about myself, that is a shift that is possible, and one of the possible outcomes of shifting away from Christ, right? You've got to find somewhere else to land. But at the same time, being on Christ or being included in Christ does not preclude us from having emotional and relational needs and needing things like therapy. And I want to make clear that I don't think that Brooks is saying that. I think he's saying what you said at the beginning, which is what we're talking about here is a shift. It's a shift away from where our identity is.
That's right. Yes. And, we get hot and bothered about living in a cancel culture. How could we not live in a cancel culture when everybody's trauma becomes a tool by which they forge identity? Then any trauma you have received at the hands of another is an instance where that other person has defiled your ability to forge a coherent self. So, canceling their voice in public life is maybe the most kind option, right?
I could see that.
Like the logical option would be full on murder. Quentin Tarantino and Django Unchained, he's got that one down.
Yes.
Like he's willing to say, okay, here's the moral universe, what it would be if you really follow these trends to their natural conclusion.
Now you're going to force me to watch that movie
That's right.
again.
Anybody who spent 30 minutes in the company of a toddler, they know that maturity means not being centered on self. That's it.
Okay.
I actually texted one of my friends here in St. Louis this paragraph where it says, in other words, a sign of maturity is the ability to respond with understanding when other people have done something stupid and given you the opportunity to feel superior. You have to be able to be vulnerable. Otherwise, you can never maintain stable relationships, stable life-giving relationships. But if every point of vulnerability is going to be used as a tool by somebody else to forge their own sense of the traumatized self, then there's no hope for relationship.
Yes, which segues us perfectly into the next article I want to talk about, which was in First Things, was Peter Leithart's book review of Nancy Pearcey's book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, where he kind of drills down into this distinction she's making between the good man and the real man. And I'll just read here what it says. It says, good men are characterized by honor, duty, integrity, and a willingness to sacrifice. They're responsible and generous, and they provide and protect, especially the weak. That seems awesome. That seems like who wouldn't want to be that? But then he goes on to say, then what she says is, real men are tough, strong, aggressive, highly competitive, unwilling to show weakness, unemotional, imposing, isolated, and self-made. They grab their guns, gold, and girls, and that they can get, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process. And I would add that even within our own evangelical circles, that they grab their Bibles and their certain forms of theology, and they grab their beard and their whiskey and their cigar, and they say, hey, here I am being a man. And so I guess my question is the version of that Nancy Pearcey is talking about and that Peter Leithart is helping us to understand better, is this real man the man that maybe Jordan Peterson is pointing us to? Do you think that's fair?
I guess I would have to say I haven't paid enough attention to Jordan Peterson to really know. I do know that one of the things that he has said in a couple of different podcasts or YouTube lectures that I've listened to, he sees the partnership between male and female, the partnership between men and women, as being one of mutual benefit, standing against the odds, is a metaphor he'll use, that because of this difference between male and female, they have been able to forge partnerships which have helped them to withstand the ravages of nature around them and have brought health and life to their communities, to their children. And why would you denigrate or why would you demean the cooperative relationship between the genders? So in that sense, I don't think he's advocating a form of masculinity that's about grabbing all the guns, golden girls that you can get. I guess from what I know of him, he would advocate for good men, not just real.
Yeah. So, and here's the reason I bring that up is I was interested to hear what your take was, because perhaps not unsurprisingly, I hear the opposite take of him. I agree with you. I think your take is spot on, but we have become a culturally undiscerning culture. We have become a
That's
culture of sound bites and snippets and video clips. And so the way that I think many people understand Jordan Peterson is that he's kind of, pushing back against all these different, woke agendas, and that he's really driving us to this place. And
he's Alex Jones with a PhD.
That's exactly right. And that's a misrepresentation of Jordan Peterson by people who have watched a 10-minute video of him and not actually read anything that he's written. Right. So
it's a deep misrepresentation. That's right.
But I do think, I think that maybe the better push is Mark Driscoll. That Mark Driscoll maybe represents this much better than Jordan Peterson has ever been misrepresented as articulating. I think this is kind of exactly the thing that we have people like Mark Driscoll and other people in evangelicalism promoting this. That this is what God expects us to be.
That's correct. Yeah. And there's been the Calvin University historian, Catherine Dumais, is that how you pronounce it? I'm not sure. In her book on John Wayne and Jesus recently that got some attention in Christian circles, she pointed out some of those same critiques. Whatever you make of her argument, I think she does build a pretty solid picture of maybe the wayward masculinization of evangelical culture across the 20th century.
Yeah, I appreciated the fact that he brought out and this was just really his piece where he says that this word helper, which appears in Genesis 2:18, is there, gets applied to the role of woman, is not about domestic helpers, but rather military allies and battle mates. That is
Yes, the English language doesn't serve us well here.
Yeah, I thought that was extremely helpful in understanding what we like to call, the article talked a little bit about the difference between the egalitarian argument and the complementarian argument, and really kind of pushing through that and saying, no, actually what we're talking about here is just having a biblical picture of what humanity is supposed to look like, and that this good man versus real man is really just kind of a creating a false dichotomy about the way that we were created to exist. And so I guess I wonder, what are you seeing from the youth, maybe particularly the young men that you're teaching now, who are following Christ, as far as this cultural tug of war between good man, real man?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I wish I paid more attention to my students' social lives than I do. I sort of, I got to prepare a lecture and then grade some essays. I'll get back to you later, kid. That kind of, and I've got my own 3 boys at home, but I'm going to spend much more of my energy and focus on their social lives than any of my students in class. But I do see, there was a joke going around my classroom last semester about, now I'm going to forget his name. Is it Alan? Is it Andrew Tate? This Romanian. I mean, I don't know if I can curse here. He's a jackass that talks about, real men use women however they want, and if you want to be a man, that means you go out and you basically do the guns, gold, and girls. And that girls are there to serve the sexual interests of men. I mean, he's the most, stereotypical low life of toxic masculinity you can imagine. But he's popular on TikTok, right? And I had some students that were sort of teasing about following his TikTok channels. And I had some female students in the classroom who were reacting against it. And I thought, who is this guy? And so I did a little Googling because, I'm 40, so I don't know these things. What are my kids paying attention to? And I realized, oh, wow, he's basically promoting or giving a public platform for incel culture. And so I came into class the next day, and I just sort of unloaded on the kids. I'm like, look, I don't know if you guys were serious or not about, teasing about following Tate and his antics on TikTok. By the way, he was arrested in Romania. Interpol had to put out a warrant for his arrest for, I believe it was a charge of rape, which, is unsurprising. And then he was actually arrested. And I just said, I know, I'm not sure whether you're serious or not, but let's talk a little bit about why he represents a vision for humanity that is, deficient. And let's then, beyond that, I mean, you expect me to say that as a Christian teacher in a Christian school. But beyond that, let's talk a little bit about how it is that his voice became popular. Why do you think that he got such a following on TikTok? And so I got to hear from them. There is a sense among some young men out there that the ordinary traits of masculinity are unwelcome in public life, right? The traits of strength and competitiveness, the traits of being focused on projects rather than relationships, right? They had a sense that these things are being pushed to the side as an inadequate pursuit for the correct way of being. I maybe even say the politically correct way of being for a man. So you have to give space to that. You have to give space to the real sense of being pushed aside. And I think that it's through that that people like this lowlife Tate can gain a following, right?
I love your opinion.
I mean, I'm trying to be
No,
kind.
you're not trying to be kind.
There's nothing.
Fine.
There's. I mean, I'll put it in the hands of my lovely wife, Gina, which is, let's pray that he will be delivered into the hands of God. Which is,
I have her praying that,
which is the worst place somebody like that can be. Yeah.
So one of the things that it occurred to me, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this article second, and then we're going to move on to this third one, but it seems like this real man kind of initiative that's happening within Christianity for sure, within evangelical Christianity for sure, actually is rooted in this therapeutic culture. It's rooted in, I don't feel masculine enough. I need to be more masculine. And so it's about feelings, right? It's not about how God defined masculinity. It's not about how God defined femininity. It's about how our culture has defined it. And then once our culture has decided we're going to define this, now I feel insecure. And now because I'm not finding my security and my identity in God, I'm finding it in the culture. Now I don't feel good. And so now I need to feel good. And so now I probably need to go buy a bigger gun. And that's not, before I get their letters from gun owners, hear me saying, I also own a 20 gauge. I'm not about not owning guns. I'm making a statement about ideological application. Jeremy, you were going to say.
Do you want me to blow your mind right now? I also own a gun.
Really?
Yeah. It's not actually in my house. It's at my dad's house, but I technically, it's got my name on it if I ever need it. I thought that would be fun. Yeah, I strike you as not the type, right?
Right.
Anyways.
So do you think that that's true, that this idea, this real men thing is actually coming from the therapeutic culture?
I think that's part of it. Also, there's this little thing called sin and idolatry, which is, there's a figure out there called Satan who's trying to get humans to build their identities on anything other than their created status before God, right? Just let's find anything. Anything will work.
Right.
So that's right. And so maybe the therapeutic culture is part of that. What I really liked about Leithart's riff on Nancy Pearcey was he lands us in the same place that David Brooks landed us in. If you go towards the last couple paragraphs of the article, he says, men are the antidote to toxic masculinity, and he's quoting from Pearcey now, because the key to developing a positive masculinity is a boy's close, loving relationship with his father. Look at that. Relationship rears its beautiful little head once again. And now we say, oh, wait, we were created for relationship. And in fact, the structure of family is one of the networks in which we find those, that we can easily find those healthful relationships. Not saying all families are healthful. That's obviously not true. That's why therapists do need to exist, right? But there it is. There's that in the created order, we were given a structure which produces human well-being. And it turns out to be relationship. What's the first thing that was lost in the fall? Relationship after the fall, right? That's that relationship with God. And, just again, speaking about my lovely wife, I don't know, I don't know if it's possible to meet somebody that's more emotionally well-grounded than my wife. If there is somebody like that out there, I haven't met them. I mean, she's just so mature compared to me. And so stable, and
she's pretty awesome.
So rigorous with herself and generous towards others. I mean, I don't meet too many people like her in public life. But one of the reasons why she is the way she is because of her dad. Her dad, who doted on her, made her the apple of his eye. She asked for, $1 to get snacks with her friends, and he would give her $5 just to make her feel like a princess.
So you're saying we should spoil our kids. That's the key. The key is spoiling.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So this then brings us a discussion about women, which is what we're discussing right now. We're married to
Anne Snyder, David Brooks.
But we're married to. So certainly David Brooks is married to a wonderful woman, but I think part of it's because our two wives were not available because we're married to two of the most wonderful women
That's right.
that I know.
You and I share. I share this with all of my best friends, Michael. We all married up.
This is so true. This is so true. So Anne Snyder, I think her article, Words Against Flesh, which is the kind of the introduction to the most recent Comment magazine. If you're not subscribing to that, you should absolutely do that. It's a wonderful, wonderful magazine. But in her introduction essay, she talks about how this kind of gender war is really doing damage. It's just doing a ton of damage, not just outside of the church, but inside of the church as well. And she says this. She talks about her childhood and what a wonderful job her parents did, because her parents, seemingly were very well grounded. They kind of knew what they were looking for. But she said this. She says, I began to wonder if there was a way to double down on my commitment to dignifying all men and women, sowing the conditions for wholeness in their sharing of this world, but to do so with quiet mischief as a woman. And I wondered if this might not be the best century to try. I love that.
You picked up on the most charming metaphor of this entire article, that quiet mischief. But as an English teacher, I mean, obviously that tickles all my heartstrings. But as an English teacher, I have to say that opening paragraph is one of the most beautiful paragraphs I have read in a very long time, and I read a whole heck of a lot of beautiful paragraphs. Can I just read it?
Yes, please do. Nice. Please don't let me stop you.
I didn't want to talk about gender for a long time. Some lucky alchemy of when I was born, nuanced role modeling, fierce love from my dad, and deep dignity in my mom imparted an understanding that to be a woman in Fool was simply to be robustly human. I understood femininity to be a lush expression of what it is to feel deeply and strive valiantly, to fulfill a multitude of roles with class and grace, to delight in the created order and all the methods humans had devised, were still devising, to understand and steward that order. And I understood masculinity to be a different expression of the same fundamental impulses, both castes equal in brilliance, both fascinatingly diverse in their cultural shape and in the comportment of individual men and women. We can stop talking now.
What's great about the video is I can now see you bowing, just kind of giving the nod of like, that was amazing.
I would bow if Anne Snyder were here. I would be on the floor doing the full on,
genuflection,
forehead to the floor bow. That is just such a beautifully written paragraph, and it perfectly articulates what is completely missing in many of the public conversations about femininity and masculinity, and that is, why did we have to antagonize these two? Right? In the created order, these things were, even the words to describe what I'm saying have been politicized. I was about to say these two things were created to complement each other, but then that becomes that word complement has become politicized because of the grotesqueness of our own search for meaning, right? Understanding where you are as a created being, and look at all that lush expression of what it is to feel deeply, strive out, feel deeply. There's feminine emotiveness. Strive valiantly. There's masculine creativeness or work-orientedness, right? She's saying that we were created for these things together. And in that way, I mean, she's saying, maybe she would not like me if I said this. She's saying a little bit of what sometimes I've heard Jordan Peterson say, which is femininity, masculinity are not necessarily at odds. They have been turned at odds because of external pressures in our current moment. But in fact, they were created and they served us for centuries in a way which helped us to fend off the dragons, as it were.
Yeah, and so I want to connect these two articles now by Leithart and by Anne Snyder. And this is back in the First Things article where Leithart writes this, that the good man is characterized by honor, duty, integrity, and a willingness to sacrifice. That real men are tough, strong, aggressive, highly competitive, unwilling to show weakness, unemotional, imposing, isolated, and self-made. And certainly the picture that Anne Snyder is painting for us is a picture of her growing up in a house with a good man and a good woman, and not somebody who is trying to be the real man, right? But then what becomes very disturbing in this article is as she goes on to say, okay, so here's what's happened now. As you said, we've turned these against each other. I think that Anne Snyder is also talking about kind of the impact of the therapeutic culture. How do I feel about myself once culture defines it? And she says this is all data points. It doesn't take much to be discombobulated. And here what I want to say is, I'm imagining David Brooks and Anne Snyder just, sitting down after dinner, talking about articles that they're working on and trying to figure out what is the craziest word each of us can use in our article. And he says, I'm going to use transmorgified. And she's like, well, that's wonderful because I'm going to use discombobulated. Just love to be in that after dinner conversation. It doesn't take much to be discombobulated by the different streams of data flowing into one boiling cauldron. For starters, the boys are not all right. They are outperformed by girls in most academic disciplines. They are more likely to feel socially excluded. Boys raised in poverty are less likely than girls to escape it, and all are tossed about by prohibitions on toxic masculinity. And I just put in here, this is the real man motif. Without recourse to a positive vision for healthy masculinity, or as Nancy Pearcey would say, being a good man. Meanwhile, girls' interior lives are suffering. The Centers for Disease Control found that between 2009 and 2015, emergency room admissions for self-harm among 10 to 14-year-old girls had tripled, and that in 2021, nearly 1 in 3 high school girls had considered suicide, a 60% rise since 2011. Separately, between 2013 and 2020, girls between the ages of 13 and 17 started seeking mastectomies, increased 13-fold, and rates of adolescent gender transition have skyrocketed, with a number of boys and girls seeking medical intervention having risen to 3,600% over the last decade. So those are the statistics that Anne Snyder presents us, and I'm not shocked by it. From what I see here in Washington D.C., I'm guessing you're not shocked from it either by what you see in St. Louis. And I wonder if she's onto something, and if that thing is actually connected to, we have really entered into the worst parts of this therapeutic culture, where it's all about how I feel. I don't like the way I feel as a woman. I don't like the way I feel as a man. And that's not to say that gender dysphoria isn't a thing that actually does occur in some cases, but that whether what's happening now is our culture is actually promoting this, and the statistics seem to say this, that this is not just a medical thing, because medical situations, genetic situations do not go up the way that this is going up right now.
That's correct. Yeah. I think that, yes, it's part of the therapeutic culture. It's also just tied into, and she points this out, the ordinary Gnosticism of our day, which is that the way to navigate to a coherent sense of self is to find that mysterious center. And where are you going to locate that mysterious center in a world that is disenchanted, in a world where there is no longer any recourse to anything other than a private God, right? There's plenty of gods on offer, but they're all privatized in our moment. And since there is no common consensus around what is the good, then we're left to ourselves, and we navigate to, ourselves. Luther has the great metaphor on this, that, his picture of sin is the soul curved inwardly up on itself. And I think that's just such a great picture of the world we're living in, actually. And she says, just one paragraph beyond where you quoted, that there's no denying that Gen Z has done away with some of the more straitjacketing stereotypes that Christians should have done away with long ago. But the solution that our culture is offering, the so-called positive vision of valuing souls as the drivers of our bodies, which are merely instruments on which to express one's freedom and felt identity, is inescapably Gnostic. And I stumbled at the word Gnostic there a little bit. I know what Gnosticism is, but it never occurred to me until Anne Snyder pointed it out, that this is fundamentally the modern Gnosticism. This is we are told to go into the self, find out the secret of yourself, which nobody else can see, and live according to that truth. And that's where you're going to find your real self.
Okay, so now you've just parked us right where we want to end this show, which is, so what do we do? What is the message you'd have for Christian leaders, for Christian high school professors, for pastors, for parents, men and women, for people who are trying to live in a posture of faithful presence in places that are difficult for them to live as Christians anyway? Because clearly what's happening here is all three of these articles are pointing out the importance of combining the spiritual, the emotional, and the relational formation, and having that being centered in the right place. And part of the reason I think you end up with Christians who think I should burn the city to the ground or I should storm the Capitol is actually just kind of this exact same issue, which is, I do not feel safe. I do not feel comfortable. Somebody needs to do something. It needs to be about me, and I need to do it right now. And as we were talking kind of pre-show, we didn't get here by accident. The church was not an innocent bystander as this was occurring. And that's not to throw the church under the bus completely, but to say the church was definitely at the design table when this was occurring. And so I guess I would put it to you, as somebody who's read so much and just very involved in these conversations, what's the way forward? How would you propose that we kind of take these articles and say, okay, so those articles were really good. Here's what we need to do. Here's what we need to think about.
I mean, if I had a really satisfying answer to that question, Michael, I think I would be living in my glorified body, right? I mean, that's the reality, isn't it? That, Solzhenitsyn's comment that when we're looking for the line between good and evil in our society, don't look out there, look through your own heart, because that line goes through your own soul. I'm trying to think about that question in this semester because I'm teaching these courses for St. Louis University, and the title of the course is Gender, Identity, and Literature. And so I'm trying to help my high school students think through some of these issues around gender and identity, the models for a stable definition of a human are now radically individualized. And I'm trying to help my students see a way around that. And I think that ultimately the answer is not going to come theoretically. I think ultimately the answer comes practically in daily lives lived, going back to what Brooks said about relationships, going back to Leithart pointed out Piercy is saying about relationships. And there's also the scholar that I've read some from. I'm talking particularly about this book, Post-Christian, by Jean Edward Veith. He's actually a literature scholar who has become something of a public intellectual. And he said, I'll just read you a quotation from the chapter called Sexual Counter-Revolution in his book, Post-Christian. It says, a Christian is part of the body of Christ, so that there is a flesh and blood connection with all other Christians. Furthermore, our body is itself designed for God's habitation. Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Is all of this just theoretical? just abstract theology, disconnected from the practical problems of everyday life? Not at all. The mindset that we picked up from the non-Christian world of trying to remake the divine mystery of marriage so that it is all about ourselves is what is not working. In our post-Christian culture, everyone is fixated on self-fulfillment. Jesus offers the way of self-denial. And he said to us all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. I cannot think of something more countercultural in this moment than that passage, where the gospel says, you want to really find your life? Don't look to yourself, right? That's shocking. That's really countercultural.
So here's what seems like maybe this is one of the things that I really enjoyed about you when we were together in Iowa City, is you just kept stressing upon me the importance of talking about the actual cultural moment that we were in, rather than to take I just want to give a really good theologically sound Reformed sermon that, really elucidates the Westminster Confession. You said, that's great. You should absolutely make sure that those things are part of your sermon. But if you're not applying them to the present culture, then you really don't have any business even getting up there and talking. Because that's where we live. We live in that place where we're having these conversations. And I need to know why that matters to me. And it does seem like what we have now in America is kind of two approaches to this, which will be the point of the topic of another podcast, most likely. And that is either we have pastors who take you need to be like Peter and take out your sword and storm the guards and cut their ears off. Or you have the version of Peter that is locked in a room for fear of the Jews, as we read in John after the resurrection, because he's terrified, and say that it does seem then that like the approach that many pastors take is either the approach to promote Peter cutting the ear off of Malchus when they come for Jesus in the garden, which Jesus is like, yeah, hey, I don't need that. Or to promote the version of Peter and the rest of the disciples that were in John chapters 20 and 21. It talks about after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to them in the upper room for the doors locked for fear of the Jews twice, right? Because they're like, okay, That's great. I know you told us you want us to go out into the world, but we are still scared, right? And so you either have this picture of kind of Christ is at war with the culture, or Christ needs to hide from the culture because like we just can't even do anything. And I think Rod Dreher has written a bit about it's just time to kind of hunker down and kind of save culture. But what we're really doing here is we're saying, hey, you know what? This moment that we're in has got to be addressed as part of the cultural as part of the cultural conversation that is taking place in the churches, because we are churning people out, and David Brooks is talking about them. Peter Leithart is talking about them, and Anne Snyder is talking about them, who are not fully formed disciples. They are misformed disciples because they have basically moral therapeutic deism. They are not grounded on who Christ is and who he has called us to be. And as Brooks says, we used to find our identity in God and we don't anymore. And the result of that is this nightmare we're living.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It sounds like we should be wrapping the conversation up, but I was reminded when reading through these articles of something that Rebecca McLaughlin wrote about in her book, The Secular Creed, Engaging Five Contemporary Claims. She wrote a chapter on the title of the chapter is Transgender Women Are Women, and she's considering Christian responses to transgender movements. And she says something about finding our identity that is pertinent to the transgender debate, but it's also pertinent to everything we've spoken about here today. Just 2 short paragraphs. Let me just read it. So what alternative hope does Christianity offer to those who feel alienated from their bodies, like their true selves are not seen, like there's something deep within them that is out of joint with their flesh? Those who feel alienated from their sex, who feel like they can't get warm in their bodies, no matter how many layers they put on, to those people, Jesus offers hope. Not the hope of a differently sexed body, but the hope of a new reality that no longer feels like labor pains. The transgender person I met after my talk in England thanked me for treating these questions with tenderness. But Jesus' tenderness utterly surpasses ours. It's the tenderness of the God who likens his love to that of a nursing mother in Isaiah 49. We can trust our fragile bodies to this God, however out of joint with them we feel, because he loves us with an everlasting love. One day he will wipe away every tear from our eyes and make our groaning bodies new. Obviously, she's speaking to the transgender issue there, but in fact, it's the heart of the concern. The heart of the concern is Christ offers us a pathway to locate ourselves in something that is much bigger, much deeper, much better than ourselves. And that's where we can find hope. That's where we can find rest.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for landing us back on the gospel. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll probably try to have some lovely parting gifts for you, which I'll bring you the next time I am in St. Louis.
Thanks for having me. I got a really nice pair of socks last time. That was great.
Well, we'll see what we can do, because I'm all, as you know, I'm all about the socks. So, Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. For everyone else, I just wanted to say, this is our very first video podcast, so we're going to see how it goes. We're going to try to, in future podcasts, maybe soften the rough edges a little bit, not too much, because we like being edgy. Really, again, thanks to my good friend Jeremy Knapp for being our kind of our trial run on this. Thank you again to all of you who tune in, who listen, who download. Again, you can now go to our website and click on this if you want to see the video version of this and check out what the latest fashions are that men should avoid, because Jeremy and I are both, highly driven fashionistas. But with that said, until next time, may our Father in heaven make you one as he and his Son are one, so that the world will know that he loves them and sent his Son for them. Go in peace. See you soon.